has an opportunity to speak in a way that many people have to listen.
People are feeling stress and concern, but unemployment hasn't gone up. Job creation is fine. Wages are in good shape.
India exercised its right to respond and preempt, as well as deter more such cross-border attacks.
I know both very well, and I want to see them work it out. I want to see them stop.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, Powell pressure. The Federal Reserve holds interest rates steady, and that goes against what President Trump has been pushing for. And nuclear roulette, tensions between India and Pakistan are escalating. Why a wider war could break out between two countries with weapons of mass destruction. Vatican decides, but not yet. The Cardinals will need to keep voting to pick the next pope after sending black smoke through the chimney today. So let's start tonight with Jo Ling Kent right here with me on set in Washington, and Weijia Jiang is at the White House. We're going to talk about all this economic news with Chairman Powell. And Jo Ling, I want to start with you, because I think most people, when they think of interest rates, they think of, okay, what does this mean if I want to buy a house or buy a car? So I guess that's my question. What does this mean, these rates remaining steady?
It means that borrowing will continue to be expensive, unfortunately, so no change on that front. The Federal Reserve basically saying they want to assess what tariffs will do to the economy. Fed Chair Powell today saying that, risk of inflation going up or unemployment going up is elevated because of tariffs, but they don't see that materializing just yet in the hard economic data. So as a result, they held again. They're likely to hold for June. So when it comes to your borrowing costs, if you want to get into the housing market, for example, I hate to say it, but rates are unlikely to get much better.
So, Weijia, over to you. I mean, the president has been highly critical of Powell for a long time, as we know. They have a complicated relationship. The president doesn't really like these kinds of decisions. He wants to see rates cut. Let's take a listen to how he responded today.
He's playing politics. Interest rates should be down now. They should be coming down. We think the Fed should lower the rate. We think that it's a perfect time to lower the rate, and would like to see our chairman be early or on time as opposed to late.
Okay, so Weijia, can you help kind of decipher where the president is on this? I mean, he's very insistent, and Powell obviously is not taking his cues from him.
So just to be very clear first, what we heard just now from the president was not from today. He actually hasn't responded yet, either on camera or on Truth Social, where he likes to post, or even via an official White House statement about today's decision. But you're right in that he has weighed in leading up to today, which is nothing new for President Trump. It's something he's been doing since his first term, expressing this frustration specifically with the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. The difference is between then and this term, he used that word politics. He said that this is not just a bad decision, but that there's a motivation behind it. And that's why economists are so concerned, because, the Fed strives to maintain its independence. It is a core factor of every decision they make, because they don't want the markets to think there is any bias or external factor going into these critical decisions about interest rates. President Trump doesn't see it that way. He has told me personally that he thinks the Fed should be listening to him. And he also denies that any of these decisions have anything to do with his aggressive tariffs policy. And again, he, is trying to explain away why these rates are not going down, when in reality, when you ask, experts who study this all day long, and I'm sure Jo Ling can weigh in on this, they will tell you, of course, that is a factor because of all the uncertainty that these tariffs have created.
Yeah, and Jo, you asked Chairman Powell about this specifically today. I think we have a little bit of sound. If we can play that exchange, then I want to get your thoughts.
Yes. For Main Street, what is the breaking point? What would have to happen to prompt a rate cut specifically?
Well, so we really don't see in the data yet big economic effects. We see sentiment, their concerns.
So what does he expect? And how is trade impacting all of this?
Well, there's a couple of things happening here. Basically, the uncertainty that we see in consumer sentiment and consumer confidence going down hasn't materialized in inflation data, jobs data, things like that. The hard data that the Fed always looks at when it comes to making a decision on whether or not to move the benchmark interest rate up or down. The other thing to point out that I thought was so interesting, we asked Chair Powell at the press conference, President Trump no longer wants to remove you from office. When you heard that, how did you feel? And he was very adamant. He had nothing to add on that front. But then later, Chair Powell was asked, by another reporter, you met with President Trump in the first term. You've met with all previous presidents. Why haven't you met with the president in this current term? And he made it really clear. He's like, we're maintaining independence. If the president wants to reach out to me and have a meeting, that's one thing. But it is not his job, in his view, to reach out to the White House to have a meeting and have more of a dialogue. So that's why you see so much of the back and forth happening, in press conferences like this.
I mean, that's interesting. To your point, they're speaking to each other, but through through the media, essentially. And Weija, I mean, that underscores your point about the need for the Federal Reserve to be completely independent. As Joe mentioned, he's threatened many times to fire Powell. But why do you think he's kind of, at least for now, backed off of that?
The president would say he has never threatened to fire Powell. And if you go back and really dissect the semantics, the wording, he doesn't really say that explicitly, but it certainly implied when he was talking about he couldn't wait until the end of Powell's term. It can't come soon enough. He was also explicitly asked in the Oval Office if he thinks he has the power to remove Powell, and he kind of sidestepped that. But, he did this in the first term as well, and he was toying with the idea of even trying to remove him. And we know back then his advisors warned him that that could really cause the markets to spiral, that it could really have a negative impact. And I think the same is true this time around. There are people close to him who got in his ear and sort of reined it back. And also he could see how his words were impacting the markets. And so even though he likes to say he doesn't pay much attention to it, we have to remember who he is. This is Donald Trump. This is a businessman, and the sort of Wall Street runs through his veins. And so whether he says it factors into his decision making or not, into his words or not, of course they do, because he could see in real time the impact.
This will be certainly a relationship in Washington, yet another one to keep an eye on. And I can't think of two smarter people to have discussed this with. Drilling Kent and Weija Jiang, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And India is preparing for possible retaliation from Pakistan after firing missiles into the country earlier today. Pakistani officials say that at least 31 people were killed in the attack and dozens more were injured. In response to the strikes, President Trump said he wants to see India and Pakistan, quote, work it out.
We get along with both the countries very well, good relationships with both, and I want to see it stop. And if I can do anything to help, I will be there.
And CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab is in London with more on this. Imtiaz, great to see you. Thank you for your time. These are some of the most intense and widespread strikes that India has carried out across Pakistan for over 50 years. Can you kind of walk us through what this means right now? What more can you tell us?
That's right, Caitlin. This really is the most significant military escalation between India and Pakistan in many decades. India launched what it's calling Operation Sindoor overnight, targeting 9 sites in Pakistan-administered Kashmir and, most worryingly, in other parts of Pakistan, including areas in Punjab province, which is the country's most densely populated and wealthiest province. It's also home to Pakistan's military. Now, India claims it's targeted what it described as, quote, terrorist infrastructure. Pakistan, for its part, says India's strikes resulted in, as we've been saying, 31 Pakistani deaths, including civilians and children, and has labeled the action an act of war. Pakistan also insists it shot down several Indian aircraft and has vowed to retaliate, saying India will pay a price, a warning that significantly raises the stakes between these two nuclear-armed neighbors with a long and bitter history of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, Imtiaz, that is why there is such a spotlight on this right now. You have two nuclear powers What exactly triggered this spike in tensions?
Yeah, it's a vital question. The immediate trigger was what can only be described as a massacre on April 22nd in Indian-administered Kashmir, where 26 Indian tourists were killed by militants. Now, India blames Pakistan-based groups called Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba for the attack, alleging they operate with support from Pakistani authorities. Now, Pakistan denies these allegations, but as we saw overnight, India conducted those airstrikes on what it identified as militant camps inside Pakistan, leading to this current escalation, an escalation which has also seen around 15 killed in shelling attacks on the Indian side over the past day. Now, we have to remember these two countries have already fought 3 full-scale wars with each other, 2 over the issue of Kashmir alone, and the fear now is things will only escalate.
I know you have reported extensively in that region. Imtiaz, thank you very much for bringing this to us, something that we will certainly be keeping an eye on. Thank you. And earlier today, we saw black smoke from the chimney at the Sistine Chapel, meaning the 133 cardinals have yet to select a new pope. Pope Francis's successor will need 2/3 of the vote, and it took him 2 days to be elected back in 2013. Here's a fun fact for you. The longest conclave on record began in 1268. That's the year 1268, and lasted more than 1,000 days. Joining us now is columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, Michael Sean Winters. Michael Sean, great to see you. Thank you for joining us from where it's all happening, the center of the universe right now at the Vatican. I've been watching this coverage all day, I must admit, and it's fascinating because we can't really see much. I mean, voting is not on camera. Can you tell us what you've learned about what happened inside the conclave today?
Well, of course, as soon as they're sequestered, which happened this afternoon when the Master of Ceremonies said, extra omnes, everybody out, the doors were sealed, and so everything is behind closed doors. What we do know is the first ballot was going to be conducted tonight. It seemed to take longer than expected. We don't know if that was just that there were more electors, whether, as happened in 2015, 2 ballots had stuck together, and the rules require that if the number of actual ballots do not tally with the number of electors, you set them aside and go to another ballot immediately. So we don't really know why it took so long, but we know 1 ballot was completed and that it was not successful as expected. I don't think we will be seeing white smoke until possibly tomorrow night.
All right, we are keeping an eye on that chimney. We've had a chimney cam all day, so we are awaiting those results. You know, this is a politics show, so I can't help but ask you, what does the politics look like in there between these cardinals during this conclave? I mean, they are picking the next leader of the Catholic Church. It's, you know, obviously a huge endeavor.
So the politics of the church is very different from, say, secular politics. There are different visions of what the church needs that are rooted in deep theological beliefs. And the church has always had this. In the Acts of the Apostles, you read about the first apostles debating on whether or not Gentiles had to be circumcised before becoming Christians. So there's always going to be some give and play. But it's not, there's no interests involved. It's not like an American political convention or something. Although the joke among the journalists has been there are 3 cardinals from Chicago in this conclave. And, you know, in Chicago, the living vote early and often, and the dead vote twice. So that's been the joke making the rounds. But the politics is very different. They're human beings, so there's a political aspect to that. But again, the lack of actual interests, I think, changes. It's about conflicting visions.
And I just want to ask you quickly, you know, who are some of the people that we are kind of keeping an eye on in terms of the top candidates? And could any Americans be considered?
We don't really know. Last week they had other secretive meetings in which everyone could get up and say what they thought the church needed, speak about a specific issue. So there are names going around. Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State to the late Pope Francis. The one American name that has gained some steam is Robert Prevost. He's been the cardinal prefect of the dicastery for bishops, which helps the Pope choose bishops throughout the world. And even though I think it's unlikely that there'd be an American, he has spent 2/3 of his life not in America. Most of his ministry has been in Peru or here in Rome. And so he's not really viewed as an American, although he does have a U.S. passport. But I think he's the only American whose name has really been in the mix. I still think it's unlikely that anyone with a U.S. passport will come out on that balcony.
Well, Michael Sean Winters, we are glad that you were watching it there for us in person, and we're all keeping an eye on that chimney to see what the news becomes. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And coming up next, the role that immigration has on this conclave and how the next pope could impact the Vatican's views on that issue. You're watching America Decides.
For an immigration policy to be good, it must have four things. For the migrant to be received, assisted, promoted, and integrated.
Welcome back to America Decides. During his papacy, Pope Francis was steadfast in his support for immigration, even at times clashing with President Trump. And for more on how the next pope could impact the Vatican's stance on migration, I'm joined now by Bishop Mark Seitz, who chairs the U.S. Conference of Catholics Committee on Migration. Your Excellency, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time, and I've been looking forward to talking to you. In the United States, as you well know, immigration has become a polarizing issue. We know that Pope Francis had frequently weighed in on the matter, and I'm wondering what you think about how the Vatican and the Church may approach this in the next papacy.
Well, for us as Catholics, the teaching of the Church on migration isn't in the first instance a political issue, but rather a gospel issue. The Lord has taught us that we have to have a special concern, a special care for those who are vulnerable, for those who are weak, for those who are poor. And so we can trust that the Church will continue to be concerned about this issue with whoever is elected as Pope, because it is a major issue, obviously, of our time. There's no question about that. There are more people who have been forced out of their homes than ever before in human history right now. And so the Church, it is her role to be there and to call attention to this suffering and to the need of these poorest of the poor among us.
And you're joining us from El Paso, of course, right on the border. This is an issue that you have talked about extensively, and see it in your own neighborhood, essentially. And I'm wondering what you've been hearing from members of your congregation, perhaps, or members of your community on how they're thinking about this as the Vatican goes about selecting the next pope.
Well, policies have implications, and the implications that we see here are tremendous. First of all, a whole group of people living in fear. Even those who have documents are uncertain about what could happen to them because they speak with an accent, because they have brown skin. Things like that make them feel that they're the center of a bullseye. Sometimes they hear stories about people being summarily sent across without the opportunity to make the case for their situation. So we're very concerned about the immigrants among us. In terms of the papacy, the Pope has an opportunity to speak in a way that many people have to listen, and he can be a conscience for leaders around the world. So obviously we do have a great desire that the Holy Spirit will guide us to a Holy Father who can speak to this need among so many others in our world.
And you mentioned that kind of conscience. I'm wondering if you imagine that this issue has any sort of impact on today's vote and the votes potentially in the next coming days about who will be the next leader of the Church.
I think what they're looking for primarily is a person who is attuned to God, who is close to God, who seeks more than anything to do what Jesus would have him do. And then we trust that that person will also express clearly these kinds of issues that are so close to the heart of Christ. And so I'm not worried about pursuing it from one particular issue, as important as this is. I'm more concerned and praying that they'll choose someone who will be a good listener to the Lord and to his Holy Spirit.
You know, I'm so fascinated by a potential relationship between the new pope and a president of the United States, especially this president, given the issues that we've been talking about. And I'm wondering if you can kind of imagine what that relationship might look like.
Well, I think that a person who serves as the vicar of Christ in the world is going to certainly have clear teachings, but at the same time, he's going to promote those teachings in a charitable and loving way. He'll be a good communicator, and he'll express what our point of view is in a way that others can hear. At times, perhaps he'll have to speak with greater clarity than others, and people won't always like that, but he'll do it in a way that is charitable. And so I'm certainly hopeful that this new leader of the church will be effective in his relationships with other world leaders.
Yeah, listening, a great quality for any type of leader. Well, we will stay tuned to Rome over today and the next coming days. But Bishop Mark Seitz, thank you so much for joining us from El Paso, Texas. We appreciate it.
Thank you. God bless you all.
And former President Biden sat down for his first televised interview since leaving the White House with our partners at the BBC. Does he have regrets about dropping out of the race just months before Election Day? Well, stick around to find out. You're watching America Decides. And welcome back to America Decides. Voice of America will carry programming from One America News. That's a far-right television outlet widely known for promoting President Trump's false claims of 2020 election fraud. Senior advisor to the U.S. Agency for Global Media, that's Carrie Lake, wrote in part on social media last night that, quote, "I don't have editorial control over the content of VOA programming, but I can ensure our outlets have reliable and credible options as they work to craft their reporting and news programs." So for more on this and more political news of the day, let's bring in our panel. Lance Trover formerly served as a spokesman for the 2024 presidential campaign of then North Dakota Governor, now Interior Secretary Doug Burgum. That's a mouthful of a title for you. And Jim Kessler was the legislative and policy director to Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. Gentlemen, great to see you both. We really appreciate your time today. A lot to get into, but I want to start with this news of a lot of America is going on right now, but essentially VOA has been disbanded, essentially, and Carrie Lake is saying Voice of America is coming in. Lance, what do you make of all of this? What does this mean?
Well, look, I mean, there's the attacks from the left are that, you know, Trump's dismantling all these things. But I think if you look at the polling out there, I mean, 1/3 of America has trust in mass media. And if you look at the White House put out a very thorough document when they first talked about VOA. I mean, we're talking about things like they were telling reporters not to call Hamas terrorists unless it was included in a quote. There were tons of reporters who were posting anti-Trump stuff on their social media in violation of the code and what you're supposed to do. You know that in journalistic ethics. Somebody should be posting stuff like that. I just think, look, you saw the hearing with NPR a month ago, the head of NPR. There is a lot of distrust in media. And so I don't personally have a problem with some conservative voices coming into Voice of America.
But essentially, out of a government-funded news source, I mean, OAN is very, very conservative. Jim, is this something that Democrats are talking about, something that they're concerned about? What do you make of all of this?
I don't think it's super high up on the list of Democratic concerns, but I've been on VOA over 100 times, okay? It was super balanced and under pretty strict rules to be balanced. I was always on, I'm a Democrat, I was always on with a Republican every single time. It is a propaganda station for America. It is now a propaganda station for the fringe right. So I think this is a diminution of VOA. It's had controversies in the past about not exactly being in the right place, but it helped us win the Cold War. Now I think it's a useless vehicle.
Speaking of another news outlet, the BBC, which is our partner station, the former president, President Biden, gave his first interview since leaving office. Let's take a listen to what he had to say, and I want to get your thoughts.
I don't think it would have mattered. We left at a time when we had a good candidate. She was fully funded. It was a hard decision, but
regrets then?
No, I think it was the right decision.
So he's saying he doesn't have regrets about the decisions that he made to drop out when he did. But Jim, I'm wondering, as Democrats are trying to find their way out of the wilderness here, what he's saying there, is that something you agree with?
There's not a huge Democratic constituency out there that's saying, I want to hear more Joe Biden right now, okay?
Understandably.
Right. Look, I think Joe Biden served America ably. All politicians are selfish, okay? He is trying to, in some ways, burnish his final credentials as he exits the stage. We don't need it right now. I think he should be off the stage. We need to hear from other Democrats.
So you think that he should be in retirement, essentially, not be engaging in... Lance, do you think that there is... I mean, I'm sure Republicans would be happy to have President Biden out there talking.
Every day. We need more interviews. We need more of that. He needs to come in here and do them with you.
Yeah. Just listening to that, I mean, do Republicans take anything away from that, anything new? I mean, this is something that they've been saying for a long time.
No, and I mean, you almost took the words out of my mouth. I mean, if I'm the Democrat, I mean, I don't know why he thinks it's good to go out there. It's certainly not helping his party, and it just reminds voters of what the choice they made last November. I mean, it's a continuation of the 4 years they were very unhappy with. And we've seen polls already that say 95, 96% of Trump voters wouldn't change their vote. You put more of Joe Biden out there, it's just going to reinforce that.
I mean, to your point, we have a lot of polling in this first 100 days of this administration. The president's numbers have certainly dropped, especially on the economy, which used to be kind of his bread and butter. But Democrats' numbers are not improving. And I'm wondering why you think that is. People may be dissatisfied with Trump, but it doesn't appear, at least yet, that they're looking to Democrats either.
Right. So I'm not alarmed right now that Democrats' numbers have not improved, because I think there's a long debate that Democrats need to have internally to become a compelling, not a repelling party again. And that will mostly happen when we go through a presidential nomination. So you can win a midterm. You can do awfully well in a midterm without having super high approval rating of yourself. It's really about the president. So I am much happier that President Trump's approval ratings has dropped a net 14 points since his first days in office. I do think he is setting himself up for a very bad midterm, regardless of how people feel about Democrats as a party.
And quickly, I mean, history shows that is traditionally the case, that we saw it with Biden even, that it's a backlash against the party in power. Do you think that's a similar dynamic now? I mean, the map does look difficult for some Democrats.
I think 108 days into this presidency, it's hard to tell. And that number I mentioned a while ago, 95, 96% of people would not have changed their vote. I think he has a pretty good foundation out there. Approval ratings are going to ebb and flow based on kind of the moment and where Americans are. If he starts getting some of these trade deals done and we see some more action and the uncertainty kind of levels out, I'm not convinced that it's all lost for Republicans just because of history.
An eternity will have happened between now and the next midterm, but I'm sure we will talk to you both about it very often. Thank you both so much for being here. We appreciate it. And back when he was a candidate, President Trump torpedoed a bipartisan border bill, and that was led by Oklahoma Republican Senator James Lankford. And we'll hear from him more about that next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. White House and congressional officials are working to wrap up and approve the budget package that is central to the president's agenda. They're hoping to do all of that by Independence Day. But how likely is it that Republicans will actually reach that deadline? Well, Republican Oklahoma Senator James Lankford answered that question and many others while speaking to our own Major Garrett in Arizona last week.
On reconciliation. It's still early, but it's also kind of late. Yeah. July 4th is looming. I've covered a lot of reconciliations bills, more than you voted on.
Right.
In the first go-round, it's imperative. It always passes. We don't know how it passes, but it always passes.
Gets done.
This will get done. Do you have some must-haves that have to be in?
Yeah, I do have multiple must-haves that have to be there. I think we'll get done not by July 4th. I think it's going to be by the end of July. July 4th is a nice optimistic goal on it, very patriotic goal, but I think it's going to be the end of July before we can actually get it finished. There's still a lot of undone. To me, the must-haves, we have to find ways to reduce spending. We have to. We're $2 trillion in overspending. We all kind of nod our head and say, yeah, it's overspending, let's find a way to slow it down. We have to find a way to slow this down. We've had several years in a row where we've had multi-trillion dollars of overspending in a year.
Beyond what DOGE has so far.
Correct. I mean, there are aspects
suggested it's accomplished.
There are aspects that DOGE can take on, but that will be in the tens to 100 billion range. We've got to be larger than that to be able to slow down our spending.
Looking back on the compromise you forged on immigration.
Yeah.
Do you think we'd be better off if that had happened? Or are we better off now that it didn't happen and we just have a different president?
No, we do have a different president that's using the same law that's been there for decades and actually enforcing it, and we're seeing very different outcomes. Thinking about the bill that passed, it should have passed. It would have fixed a lot of the loopholes that are in the law, and it would have been easier to be able to do enforcement now. Because one of the challenges that we have is our asylum laws do include a lot of loopholes in them that cartels have exploited for years. They become experts in exploiting our law because it's billions of dollars of income to them when they can find those loopholes and gaps. I heard a commentator just last week saying the courts are challenging these different ways that President Trump is enforcing the law. Somebody needs to bring up a bill. True story. Somebody needs to bring up a bill to be able to close some of these loopholes. And it was a conservative commentator that was saying it, and I laughed and I thought, I know somebody that's brought one of them.
I know a guy.
Yeah, I know a guy, and I know a bill that could do that. Now, was the bill everything that I wanted? No, I'm negotiating with the Democrat White House at the time to be able to get it done. But many of the areas that we need to close the loopholes were in that bill. And some form of that we will eventually get done.
And if I read that bill legislative summary correctly, would have had more of the personnel to adjudicate things faster.
Right. Yeah, we were adding more judges, we were adding more ICE agents, we were adding more Border Patrol agents, we added more border wall. We added additional funding that the administration is looking for now would have already been there on January 1 to be able to be there and ready to be able to go when the new White House is actually sworn in.
So now, we would be better off if I hear you correctly.
I do believe we would be, and I think the other thing is last year we had 1 million people that illegally crossed our border after that bill failed. That 1 million people wouldn't have been here.
There are a lot of people in the administration who talk in large structural terms about what they believe this second term is about.
Yeah.
About turning over a lot of things that the world and America understood for the better part of 80 years. A, do you believe that's true, that that's what this next 4 years is about? And if you were to try to describe it to the average Oklahoman, what's in it for them, how would you do that?
What most people want to say is, I just want to feel like things are right. I want to feel like that things are actually moving. They felt the chaos of the open border, and even if it didn't affect their family specifically, they just didn't like the chaos of that. They want to just know, what are we doing to be able to stop criminal activity at our border? What are we doing to stop that? That makes sense to them. I've had a lot of folks that have said, I just don't like the conversation about boys being in girls' locker rooms. I just don't like that. And they may not could even describe anything on it other than saying, that just doesn't feel right to me, and I have daughters, or I just don't like that kind of tone. Don't want to be disrespectful of any person, but just don't like that. Same thing when you talk to them about trade. They'll say, why do other countries run over us on trade? I know we're a wealthy nation and we're buying products from all over the world, But why can't we sell our products there? That just doesn't make sense to people. So if I can wrap it up in one thing that I hear from Oklahomans at home is they just want the world to make sense again because they feel like it didn't make sense and they want it to be able to make sense again to them, to be able to have a reasonable thing to be able to do.
So I'm older than you, which means I have some recollection of the 60s.
Yeah.
I have two older siblings who were farther deeper into that than I was. And there was a cultural rejection of conformity. And it strikes me that in this technological world, there is a phenomenal amount of pseudo-individualism that writ large is very conformist.
Right.
Do you ever wonder, as I do, if there will be a cultural rejection or rising up against the conformist nature of technology? I wonder if there's ever going to be that pushback.
I think it's already occurring. When I talk to teenagers, for many teenagers, they've made a decision they're going to use less social media. They've watched the people that are in college and just above them. They see it. They see some of the dangers, and I'm seeing a whole group.
The anxiety,
that's correct.
The depression.
They're already shifting that way. I talked to
body consciousness, all sorts of things that they were never part of your conversation.
Right.
It's certainly never part of my conversation.
No, never. And I talked to an executive. I'll leave his name and his company out. That was a Silicon Valley executive, and I asked him, "What social media platform do your kids use?" And he laughed and goes, "Oh, none. I won't allow them to use it." And I thought, really? He was like, "Oh, no, I'm not letting him get in social media. There's no way I'll do that." And I thought, this is a person who knows the algorithms. He knows all the issues, and he knows the dangers and risks. He's like, yeah, I prohibit this in my kids, but he was glad to sell it to other kids on it. So the challenge that's out there is, does a generation decide they're going to model exactly what they're seeing in front of them that was destructive? Or does a generation rise up and say, that looks destructive to me? I think it's the latter.
And professors are expressing concern about the Trump administration's feud with the nation's top universities. We'll speak to one next about why he thinks the president is sending us, quote, back to the dark ages. You're watching America Decides.
The laws don't say you can engage in extortion. And when you simply cut off all funding based on a set of conditions, that's extortion.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was former Harvard University President Larry Summers talking about the Trump administration's acts against the institution. He said he thinks the president's ultimate goal is for universities to, quote, bend the knee. Alan Lightman joins us now. He's a professor of the practice of humanities at MIT. Professor, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time. You wrote a piece in The Atlantic, which I have here. I've highlighted many bits of it, about this threat on academic freedom in the wake of some of these administrations' actions. And I'm wondering if you could kind of tell us what the overall impact is. What's at stake here?
Well, at stake is the good functioning of colleges and universities in the United States. I think colleges and universities in our country have made America great, and they operate in an atmosphere of academic freedom, which is the ability to discuss and debate ideas without fear of outside censure or outside restrictions, the ability to let the mind wander. And many of the great inventions and innovations in our country have come out of universities and colleges. So that's what's at stake here. When we look at other countries that don't have academic freedom, like China and Russia, we see much less innovation.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned in this piece, the internet came from researchers that developed it at UCLA, Stanford, MIT. The first artificial heart was, developed at the University of Utah. Lithium batteries, the list goes on and on.
Right.
I'm wondering, though, what you make of the administration's argument. They're saying, in part, that this is about protecting the academic freedom of Jewish students, that these higher institutions have become kind of a harbor for anti-Semitism. Do you agree with that? What do you make of that part of the argument?
No, I think that's a guise. That's an excuse to strangle in the universities, which often tends to be towards more liberal, free thinking. And I believe that using the excuse of anti-Semitism on campus is just a ruse. It's a guise. I don't think that that's the real issue.
If the federal government is providing funding through grants to universities, should they have a say as to, what the universities do here? Does that give them any sort of stake in the university?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, the universities and colleges are for the benefit of all of our citizens, just like roads and bridges are. And state and federal government, they provide funding for roads and bridges. They don't tell the engineers exactly how to build those bridges and roads. They leave that to the expertise of the engineers. And so I think that the situation is similar here, that colleges and universities in the U.S. have been operating for a long time now. And we know that academic freedom or freedom from outside interference is very important to the atmosphere and the ethos within universities. So I think we should just let the universities do what they have done well in the past 250 years.
And, universities like Harvard and others have big endowments, but I'm thinking of others that may not have that to fall back on. What can those institutions do if they want to fight back on this?
Well, I think that it's a very serious problem for smaller universities and colleges without large endowments. And I would say that even the universities with large endowments, they do depend a lot upon outside funding. I think we're going to have to see the private sector pick up some of this funding if the federal government cuts off funds. But I think it's a kind of blackmail. I think what's behind this is that the current administration wants to throttle the kinds of ideas and criticism that come out of colleges and universities. But of course, criticism is part of academic freedom. We discuss, we debate, we challenge authority. That's the nature of the ethos and atmosphere in colleges and universities.
Yeah, as you say in the piece, academic freedom is what has made America great. Well, we will continue to follow this, and we really appreciate you coming on to talk about this piece. Alan Lightman, thank you very much.
Thank you, Caitlin.
And that does it for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report is coming up next on CBS News 24/7.